Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Not many people are saying it out loud on the right, but the fact is that President Trump could well lose this election. In fact, unless fundamental facts change soon, it could be tough for him to be reelected. If the president does lose, that would mean that just a few months from now, Joe Biden would become the president. The United States government would fall under the control of the radicals who control Joe Biden, and they will remake the country. Now, we're fully aware that virtually nobody watching this show tonight wants to hear that, but it's true, and key people around the president know that it's true. They've seen the numbers. They're concerned. At some point in the future, historians will marvel at the fact that the president lost ground during a pandemic and then during mass riots. Both crises should have highlighted his strengths. They were naturals for him. Alone among national leaders, Donald Trump warned Americans for decades about China and the perils of globalization. Everything about the Wuhan coronavirus proved Donald Trump right. China really is our main global adversary. The Chinese government really does want to take over the world. Meanwhile, the fact that we sent our manufacturing base abroad really has weakened us badly. The most powerful nation on earth no longer makes antibiotics. Maybe we're not as powerful as we think. All of that is very obvious now after the pandemic, but Donald Trump called it. You'd think voters would reward him for that. You'd think the riots would have increased their support for him. An awful lot of people voted for Donald Trump precisely to avoid a moment like the one we're now in. None of this arrived suddenly. We saw it coming. Social cohesion in America has been eroding for decades. People sense that. It made them nervous. It should make them nervous. Donald Trump seemed like insurance against the consequences of that. The core appeal of Trump was, if things ever started to fall apart, he would defend you. Yes, he was loud and crude. Most bodyguards are. Only a man like Donald Trump was tough enough to fight the creeping authoritarianism of the education cartel and corporate America. If Trump got elected, you could say what you really believe. The basic promise of America could be restored. You could live with dignity. Under Donald Trump, you wouldn't be forced to mouth the lyrics to some repulsive little orthodoxy you hate. You could declare out loud that all lives matter, because all lives do matter. God made us all. And if you can't say that, what's the point of living here? Donald Trump never quite articulated any of this in a precise way. He's not an intellectual or an ideologue. But it was obvious he felt it strongly. Trump's gut-level instincts were on the side of order and tradition and stability, and they still are. And yet when widespread looting and disorder arrived, the president did not act as decisively as many had hoped. He said little, he did less. Some voters felt undefended. Some turned against him. Why did this happen? Well, there are many reasons. Trump was exhausted, for one thing, after 3 years of defending himself against Russiagate, the most elaborate and effective hoax in American history. And his staff did not very much to help. Some of them were actively disloyal. Most were just confused. They definitely were not prepared for Chinese viruses or burning cities. But the administration's main problems were conceptual. Few seemed to understand what was really happening. Their first mistake was forgetting the primary rule of Washington. In an election year, everything that happens is about the election. There are no exceptions to that rule. Washington is a political city. It's run by politicians. If the Chinese Navy sailed up the Potomac in the fall of an election year, the first thing most people in D.C. would wonder is, how's that going to affect turnout? That's who they are. It's how they think. So only the naive were surprised when Democratic governors immediately used the coronavirus quarantines to punish people who didn't vote for them. Christian churches and small businesses were locked down. Weed shops and abortion clinics stayed open. Most Trump voters seemed not to notice. They accepted the restrictions without question. This was a health crisis, and they wanted to do the right thing. So they obeyed. They cowered in their homes. And that's exactly where Democratic leaders wanted them, cut off from one another, atomized, and alone.